We can.
All right. So, hi everyone. Good evening and good afternoon to Francis, our guest for the evening today. And he has a great connection with India apart from joining us today. His wife is Indian. And so the connection goes far beyond. Well, I would like to welcome you all here, all the members and candidates from different parts of India. And I would especially like to welcome our guest, Dr. Francis Grier, who is a musician himself. So, of course, what follows up is his interest brings and connects psychoanalysis with music, and he's looking into different aspects of music in and with psychoanalysis. So that is what he is going to take us into the journey into this rhythmic musicality with psychoanalysis. I hope that all of you would enjoy this and would be able to share your evocation and experience with music and psychoanalysis once after the paper is concluded. So I invite now Sarosh, who's the senior member from Mumbai and who's chairing the webinar today, to introduce Francis in detail and then to move on to Dr. Grier.
Yeah. So welcome, and it's really a pleasure to see you all. We've been talking about Kolkata celebrating the centenary of psychoanalysis, and there's been a huge amount of work, very dedicated work, initiated by the President, Pushpaji, and our Secretary, Bharati. These efforts particularly have brought the chapters like Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata closer together. And I think this thereby strengthens our society. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce today's webinar, where again Kolkata has brought us all together by inviting Dr. Francis Grier for us to hear him, the new editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. He's also a training analyst and a supervisor of the British Psychoanalytical Society. He's also a couple psychotherapist. He works in private practice in London. He leads a seminar for psychotherapists in the Fitzjohn's unit of the Tavistock Clinic, which specializes in working psychoanalytically with patients who would not normally have access to psychoanalytic treatment. He has written and edited papers, chapters, and 2 books on couple psychotherapy, including Oedipus and the Couple in 2005, and papers for the IJP on 2 Verdi operas, Rigoletto and La Traviata, and on a gendered approach to Beethoven, on musicality in the consulting room, and on the music of the drives and perversions. Before training psychoanalytically, he was a professional musician. He gave the first ever solo recital at the Royal Albert Hall Proms concert in 1985. And in 2012 was awarded a British Composer Award. Francis has also done some important work by commissioning new papers. And also I heard and believe that he's involving himself with humanitarian efforts in the ongoing war. Now the paper is around 50 minutes long, reading time. I have heard that some find it difficult to listen for a longer time on Zoom. So there is an idea, if Francis is okay with it, to give pauses after, say, 15 or 20 minutes for 30 seconds, where someone could ask something briefly or want further clarification. This might be more helpful in listening. And if no one says anything, we can continue and move on. But of course, it's up to Francis, who might prefer to read the full paper, after which we have time for discussions. So Francis, I now invite you to read your paper on musicality in the consulting room.
Well, thank you very much, Sarosh, and thank you all for inviting me. Yes, I'm not sure about stopping. My feeling is that we wouldn't stop for just 30 seconds. I think if anybody asks a question, I mean, I talk far too much. So, you know, if somebody asks me a question, I'll probably keep talking really after that, and then we won't get to the rest of the paper. I think I'll read the paper and then I hope that you'll have plenty to say. I'm sure you will have plenty to say. I've been to India so many times, and music is everywhere, of course, in India, whether it's the classical traditions of the North or the South, or you know, the film tradition, Bollywood, you know, very different things. But of course, what I'm really thinking about is the music of the voice. The spoken word, the music of the spoken word. That's what I'm trying to get at, as I will spell out. And of course, that is obviously different in India, where there are so many dialects and so many different languages that people speak. Every one of those has a sort of basic musicality of their own. And then on top of that, there's the way every individual will actually speak and relate. So here goes. It's called Musicality in the Consulting Room. This paper explores some thoughts about the musicality that underlies the psychoanalytic clinical encounter. So I had another thought. Bharati asked me if she could send round my paper this is from the International Journal. If you have, and if you've got it in front of you, you'll find that what I'm reading is an abridged version, a shorter version. So it won't completely be the same as what you're reading. One approach to this topic lies through the subject of reverie. In recent years, perhaps the most widely discussed avenue by which the analyst and the analytic couple aim to engage with the specifically unconscious dimensions of the patient's mind and that of the analytic couple. Visual imagery predominates as the vehicle within theories and illustrations of reverie. If music is named at all, it tends to be named metaphorically. The elaboration of a specifically musical dimension to reverie, and indeed to clinical analysis generally, lags far behind. Through dialogue with particular papers that have stimulated reflections in this domain, I will now set out some ideas about the place of music within clinical psychoanalysis. During the course of the paper, I will elaborate on what I mean by musicality. But at the outset, I will state that my focus is on the specifically, not only symbolic, musical dimension, i.e., that which involves the musical parameters of pitch, melody, harmony, dissonance, rhythm, timbre, tempo, and the musical dynamics of loud and soft, also involving crescendos and diminuendos. David Black, in his 2004 paper, discusses the primal place of sympathy in the sense of an absolutely natural and even involuntary capacity in virtually any human or animal. Black quotes David Hume's definition of sympathy. This is from 1739. We may begin, this is the quote from David Hume, with considering anew the nature and force of sympathy. The minds of all men are similar in their feelings and operations, nor can anyone be actuated by any affection of which all others are not, in some degree, susceptible. As in strings equally wound up, the motion of one communicates itself to the rest. So all the affections readily pass from one person to another, and beget correspondent movements in every human creature. End of quote. A musical aspect to this primary meaning of sympathy is immediately in evidence in Hume's notion of automatic, sympathetic resonances between tuned, stringed instruments. Darwin considered this capacity to be present in various creatures, including dogs, monkeys, elephants, pelicans, and crows, commenting that someone lacking this quality would be like a monster. By sympathy, Darwin means something somewhat different from our modern definition of sympathy. His sense is very close to a primary identification, and Black underlines the fact that sympathy, in our more contemporary usage, has this first, more elemental sense underlying it, as does empathy. For Darwin, sympathy is one of the maternal instincts, and therefore constitutes a primal quality in our psychophysical makeup. In the course of the paper, Black refers to Daniel Stern. Quote, Stern's 1985 important notion of affect attunement presupposes a sympathetic connection between mother and child. End of quote. Black, following Stern, links the way that mothers respond to and play with their babies to this notion of primal sympathy, underlying the various ways in which they tune into their baby's affect. This emotional traffic also operates in the reverse direction. Babies have an instinctive sympathetic response to their mothers, tuning in emotionally to their affects and playing correspondingly. The vehicle for much of this communicative play is music. Mothers and babies will sing to each other long before they use conscious verbal communication. Even when mothers talk to their babies using ordinary verbal language, what the baby receives is the emotional communication via the music of the maternal voice. Of relevance here are the current controversies about the evolution of language and music, and quite how closely they are or are not related. Per A.G. Brandt, professor of cognitive sciences at Case Western Reserve University, writes, "We do not currently know in detail how our mental and neural architecture has shaped the relation of language to music. We do not yet know if music and language evolved independently or if language could have evolved without music." End of quote. Jack Pansep, professor of animal well-being science at Washington State University, and Colwyn Trevarthen, professor of child psychology and psychobiology at Edinburgh, write, "Infant studies show that musical communication exists between human infants and their mother before the emergence of propositional speech. With maturation, the diverse emotional musical communications of the infant separate into two streams. Propositional speech flows towards the left hemisphere, while the prosodic emotional stream flows more forcefully into the right hemisphere. The same rhythmic phrases and affective tones, melodies and prosody of intentional activity are shared in music and language from their earliest stages through the most complex elaborations. The brain that learns language is an organ of intersubjective collaboration, and to this end has systems of emotional regulation that are fundamentally musical." End of quote. So music and language interrelate and collaborate, but are not identical. One cannot therefore effectively disregard the music of speech, claiming that it is taken up into the words, assuming, that is, that the words are indeed articulate. Alongside words, or possibly behind them, there coexists a musical communication, typically an expression of emotion, perhaps overlapping with verbal thoughts and words, yet at some level not identical with the verbal domain, and needing, particularly in a culture which sets a predominantly high value on cognition and rationality, to be apprehended through the development of a musically intuitive and perceptive ear. However, analysts may be quite resistant to tuning into this level of musical communication, particularly if it runs contrary to the surface meaning of the words. For example, a patient may make mention of some bad weather, some lowering clouds, and it has only been, speaking for myself, after several minutes have passed, that I have woken up to the fact that the patient was almost certainly making an unconscious observation about my own state of mind, of which I myself had been unconscious or preconscious, as I had been trying to ignore my own unpleasant feelings. I realized that it was some quality of the musicality of the patient's expression which had got through to me, triggering a sympathetic resonance. For his words drew no special attention to themselves, the subject matter about the clouds fitting quite unobtrusively into the superficial context of the session. This example can stand for many others. A patient will pick up on various feelings in the analyst, of which the analyst would much prefer the patient to remain ignorant, and indeed which the analyst himself might prefer to ignore. It is the music, time and again, I suggest, which alerts us to this via our automatic sympathetic musical response. Not that the patient's music needs to be obviously or flagrantly musically demonstrative. In the session mentioned above, the patient had been speaking about conscious issues in a rather overtly expressive musical way, whereas when he alluded to the lowering clouds, the music of his communication modulated to a softer, more tentative tone. It was precisely this inhibited musical quality that awakened a sympathetic resonance in me, and then a verbal curiosity. This exemplifies Stern's concept of affect attunement, and perhaps even more so, Black's sympathy. My patient, I believe, intuited my unconscious mood sympathetically, by which I do not mean compassionately. Quite unintentionally and unconsciously, attributing it not to me, but to the external weather. He then verbalized it metaphorically, but more importantly, sang musically about it in a way that my musical ear picked up. I do not reckon that my secondary process thinking was alerted by his comment about the external weather. I make no particular claim from my musical ear on account of my trained musicality. This was an instance of a quality of musicality that is general and widespread, possibly universal. I judged that I needed to make some rejoinder to my patient's comment about the weather. I said that I thought that he felt that he may have intuitively picked up some underlying depressed mood in me. I did not develop this point, believing it not to be helpful for analysts to divulge much information about themselves to patients, whereas I consider analysts should go at least part way to confirming their patients' perceptions. Given my usual reticence in this area, my patient was obviously surprised by my interpretation, but also accepted it quietly, saying that he hadn't thought about it consciously at all, but perhaps it could be so. After a pause, he and we picked up from where he had left off with his previous train of thought. I felt it important to respond in a simple, low-key manner, which matched perhaps an example of sympathetic affect attunement, the muted musical tone in which he had stated his observation about the clouds in the first place. With this rather sensitive patient, this may have enabled him to feel that the focus of my attention remained essentially on him rather than on myself. In the immediate term, meaning not only for the remainder of the session, but for about 2 years afterwards, No further reference was made to this incident. The patient then referred back to it through a chain of associations, and it turned out to be an important event for him, confirming his own capacity, which he had severely doubted, for tuning in intuitively to someone else's frame of mind, and to find that when this was received by the other person, the analyst, it apparently led to no harm to the couple. This disproved his unconscious fantasy of catastrophic, dissonant consequences, in which the music would express my fury or my pain, or both, through his penetrative, to him synonymous with hostile, observation. He anticipated being guilty of setting off a train of destructive events, damaging to the couple, whose duet would then become a miserable one. Instead, his experience had become of a couple both sensitive but also robust, in which his observation about the other's mind and feelings, even though the song in question was a sad one, could contribute to the musical creativity of the couple. I can use this example because evidently I became conscious of it. I am sadly confident that many such examples occur regularly in which I am not properly attuned to the musicality of my patient's communications, for any number of possible reasons, particularly, as nearly happened on this occasion, because of my resistance to the content of the communication. By content, I include its verbal content, but I mean much more its musical content. I don't mean musical as synonymous with emotional, but rather as the vehicle through which the core of the emotion is expressed. The particular emotion in question then needs to be articulated within a psychoanalysis in terms of secondary process verbal understanding. Yet it needs also to be acknowledged that the musicality underlying the verbal expression will often point to an ineffable, literally non-verbalizable quality of emotionality conveyed through the music of the voice. On this occasion, my patient was highly sensitive to my private disturbance of mind. But even so, I had to fight through an internal struggle to allow this communication to become conscious. On many an occasion, such a penetration of intuitive insight from the patient can feel unwelcome, intrusive, disturbing, and even insulting. This is ironic because the patient is constantly making himself vulnerable and exposed to the analyst's intuitive insights, simply by way of being a patient. As analysts, we can sometimes become desensitized as to how hostile even our compassionate intuitions can feel to the patient, until, that is, we have experiences such as the one I have just described, one that bring home to us the vulnerability of the patient's responses. Analysts have all been patients, but we may be quite invested in denying, ignoring, and forgetting just how unnerving it is to receive psychologically penetrating observations and interpretations, all the more so when they are truthful. Whichever way round it is between patient and analyst, the deep emotional truthfulness of such insights inevitably involves an ingredient of pain, and the intensity and degree of authenticity of the exchange, along with its accompanying insights, will always be mediated via the music of the encounter. However, for musical encounters between the analytic pair to yield conscious results, they have to be recognized consciously as such. I have argued in a previous paper that following Freud, psychoanalysis turned a deaf ear to the musical level for many years. This present paper is symptomatic of the welcome change that is occurring within our discipline, and yet the old habit dies hard. A paper by Ogden exemplifies the paradox shared by many publications, that it does not truly mention music when one might expect it to. Ogden has written extensively about the process of reverie, for example, in his paper entitled The Music of What Happens, in poetry and psychoanalysis, evidently apposite to this discussion. The paper is typically creative. Yet, significantly, the word music only occurs in the title and in the quote from Seamus Heaney that precedes the paper. This quote is itself referred to once near the start of the paper. From then, a self-conscious engagement with music is absent. The way in which Ogden discusses his reverie, both regarding the analytic session and also in response to the poem, demonstrates his attentiveness in each case to mood and atmosphere. It also exemplifies how, almost despite his disclaimers, he is concerned to find verbal meaning derived from his reverie, not in a two-dimensional this means that, but through a process of more intuitive reflection, even contemplation of the elements of his experiences during reverie. He simultaneously operates in a world of rational and external significance, whilst swimming, even floating, in a less rational world of dreamlike and otherwise free associations. In Ogden's case, these elements of reverie take a verbal form. But Bion seems to me to have been describing a primarily non-conscious, non-verbal process in his original formulation about alpha function, which is usually taken to refer to pictorial processing. My paper is partly motivated by a desire to emphasize the place of musical associations as a fundamental element within alpha function and containment. In my view, its primal significance has been neglected by virtually all writers on the subject. In contrast, we have an account from one of Freud's patients, articulating her consciousness of Freud's own musicality during her analysis. And here's the quote. One of his patients, who had undoubted aesthetic sensibility and talent, namely the imagist poet Hilda Doolittle, has reported that Freud spoke English without a perceptible trace of accent, and that the beautiful tone of his therapeutic voice had a singing quality that permeated the texture of the spoken word. Whether or not these features were a legacy from his former role as a clinical hypnotist, they could not have been achieved and maintained by someone with a pervasively defective ear. That's the end of the quote. Freud said that he had a defective ear, and Hilda Doolittle, his patient, says, no, absolutely not. So it is satisfying to illustrate the importance of musicality from the avowedly non-musical figure of our founding father. Now, one author who wrote specifically about musical clinical dimensions in the early years of psychoanalytic theorizing was Sybil Yates. She finishes her paper, Some Aspects of Time Difficulties and Their Relation to Music, with some generalized musical psychoanalytic principles. Her principal finding, quote, that all that is most fundamental to a person's appreciation of time and rhythm originates in a pattern laid down at the breast period, when the body supplies the rhythm, end quote, does indeed seem, as she writes, fundamental. Although we might now reframe this as more accurately true of the postnatal infant, since pre-birth, we now know that the fetus experiences and continually participates in many different experiences of rhythm, tone, dynamics, timbre, and intensity. The inside of the mother's body is a highly variegated sonic space, and the fetus presumably undergoes very many variegated experiences of often being completely merged with these musical sounds, yet also being in some proto-primal way separate or potentially separate from them and in relationship with them. Presumably a major feature of the traumatic aspect of the mother and fetus separating at birth is the loss of their musical merger or non-differentiation, and a universal craving may arise to refine the music of that primal merger. When contemplating expressions of the longing for this ideal merger, we naturally associate to physical experiences of bodies coming together, such as the baby at the breast and sexual intercourse. But we may neglect sonic, oral, and musical expressions of this sense of a fluid movement between being utterly merged with another, no sense of separateness, and a contrasting sense of non-merger, a sense of being in relationship with a separate other person. Experiences in later life of being surrounded by aggressive, chaotic, and alarming, sometimes very loud sounds, for example, when alone with the elements, perhaps in a storm, presumably reawaken extremely frightening musical experiences of being inside mother's stormy body, impotent to effect any change. By contrast, benign, sometimes beatific experiences of being enfolded in tranquil and beautiful sound presumably link us unconsciously to good, serene experiences inside mother's peaceful body. Breastfeeding and loving sexual intercourse both constantly involve musical sounds, as noted by Melanie Klein in her analysis of 13-year-old Felix's marked love of music, which she traced back through anxieties and inhibitions to early infantile observations of coitus. It proved that sounds, this is a quote from Klein, some of which he had heard proceeding from his parents' bed, and the rest of which he had fantasized, had formed the basis of a very strong interest in music. End of quote. This quotation incidentally recalls the moving passage towards the end of Klein's analysis of 10-year-old autistic Dick, when they are playing the piano together. Klein talks about the importance to him of making music in terms of being able to make manifest the voices of the internal babies in harmony with the piano standing for the mother's body. Fetuses also hear musical sounds outside of the maternal body, including mother's voice, which they clearly recognize after birth. A patient told of how, during her pregnancy, she had listened regularly to Indian tabla music. I can actually tell you this is my wife. Her baby suffered badly, our baby, from colic, which nothing could soothe, until quite by chance, she again played the recording of tabla music. Miraculously, the baby reacted with surprise, recognition, and evident pleasure, distracted from the colic, immediately becoming soothed. This example is a happy one, but there exist symmetrically unhappy ones, where the baby might associate various musics to disturbing and frightening musical experiences in utero. So, to return to Yeats's primary finding, we might now put it that the musical feeding experience consolidates and develops the pre-birth musical engagement of mother and fetus, starting perhaps with the relationship between the heartbeats of the mother and the fetus. It's easy to imagine the link between music and harmonious experiences of the fetus and of the infant, such as the soothing sound of the mother's quietly singing voice. But the link between music and disturbingly anxiety-provoking experiences is just as real, as is illustrated by this lively description in the first full account of the analysis of a young child ever to be published by Melita Schmideberg, Klein's daughter, of her 3-year-old patient, Vivian. And here's the quote. Vivian's fear of music proved to be a very resistant symptom. The analytic material showed her association of noise with sadistic intercourse. The men, this is what the child talked about, the men break the house with noise, and also with the sounds of urination and defecation. She once complained that she had an awful headache because her baby, the doll, had cried a lot. I interpreted that she herself, when a baby, had cried a great deal, so as to give her mother a headache, break her head, and that now she was herself afraid, if she heard noise or music, lest her own head should be broken. This led to a sudden improvement. That very day, she heard music without manifest anxiety, and next day she played that her doll was ill because she had heard music. Now that her anxiety had abated, she could deal with it in play, by nursing her doll. Just about this time, Vivian was afraid whenever she failed to find her mother in the waiting room before her, and on one such occasion, she controlled her wish to cry, but made some music, so-called, which sounded exactly like crying, so that the connection between music and crying became quite clear. End of quote. And I note in parenthesis that the experience of twins may be very different. All these experiences and every aspect of these experiences in utero contain fundamentally significant musical dimensions. The overall sounds, different and particular sounds in polyphony and counterpoint, the relationship between different sounds, their literal musicality in terms of pitch, rhythm, timbre, dynamics, volume, intensity, harmony, dissonance, may often be involved at every stage. Possibly for the fetus, the musical oral dimension may often be the principal proto-conscious experience. Oral AU with the ear, not oral with the mouth. And just as infants lead their mothers in musical games as much as vice versa, so I would speculate the fetus contributes to all these experiences as much as the mother. An important dimension connected with innate constitutional character would be added perhaps by the particularity of the inherent musicality of the fetus. Of course, in response within the parameters of the musical duet, the fetus is singing and or playing with the particularity of the inherent musicality of the mother and her body. The particular fetus's response to the particular mother is indeed particular and unique. The totality of this musical experience, as Yeats so rightly says, is brought forward into all the dimensions of future life, including, if that's the direction the future life takes, into the consulting room. And not only as a patient, but in some cases as a psychoanalyst. The first theoretician to explore these proto-musical levels systematically and at depth was Anzieu, the French psychoanalyst. Anzieu had already articulated his sense of a skin self, and he developed his ideas further to include a sound envelope he called it, for the self, which he considered to be even more primitive than the skin self. As he writes, quote, "As a result of the experience of the sound bath, the self emerges as an envelope of sound, concomitant to the self as a suckling. This bath of sound prefigures the skin self, with one half of its double-faced turned to the inside and the other half to the outside. Since the sound envelope is composed of sounds coming alternatively both from the environment and from the baby, this combination of sounds produces a common space volume, which permits of a bilateral exchange, whereas sucking and elimination constitute only a one-way flow. B, a primary image, a spatio-auditive one, of the imminent body. And C, a link of actual fused reality with the mother, without which the imagined fusion with her later on would not be possible." And then another quote from Anzieu: "The child can only stimulate himself to listen to his own sounds if his environment prepared him to do so by the quality, elaborateness, and volume of its sound bath. Before the look and smile of the nursing mother has sent back to the child an image of himself that is visually perceptible and which he can use to strengthen his own self and start his ego, the melodious bath, the voice of the mother, her songs, the music she created for him, have provided him with a primary sound, echo mirror, which he manipulates, first for his cries, calmed down by mother's voice, then for his babbling, and finally for his games of phonemic articulation. End of quote. Anzieu's work is one of the influences on recent paper by Dana Berkstead-Breen, who only fleetingly makes specific mentions of music, yet whose work seems permeated with proto-musical resonances. Reverberation time is the term she gives of the time needed by the mother or analyst for taking in, then unconsciously contemplating and working through her infant's or patient's emotional projections, before returning them in a transformation digestible to the infant or patient, beyond's reverie and alpha function. The dimension of time is itself musical, as well as its rhythmic recurrence, but even more so is the sense of reverberation, in which the mother or analyst could be described as resonating musically with her infant's or patient's agitated or disturbed musical projections, eventually returning them in some more coherent musical form. Indeed, such an emotional duet between mother and infant will often take a quite overtly musical form. In Taking Time, Berkstead-Breen develops those ideas. Her theme is the importance of the analyst's capacity for free association, even with suspended attention, for dreaming, in short, for receptivity to what may emerge intuitively and in an unforced manner, unbidden from the analyst's mind. This, she claims, is the hallmark of a specifically analytic process, and is to be contrasted with too much busily active thinking and talking. Berkstead-Breen's principal focus is on visual rather than musical images. In the abstract of her 2012 paper, she writes, "In fact, with those patients, reverie and the visual images it produces within the analyst's mind offer perhaps the only hope of a meeting ground between the concrete and the symbolic, and the possibility of avoiding an impasse." End of quote. There seems no reason, however, why such images should not be auditory and musical rather than visual, particularly because, in the context of the appearance of dreamlike material from the analyst's unconscious, it is quite possible that, depending on their personality, some analysts will be more prone to find auditory musical communications emerging from their unconscious. Since there was a stage in the development for each of us when sounds and music in the womb dominated our proto-consciousness, there exists the potential for any analyst in their reverie to experience sounds and music as well as images emanating unbidden from their unconscious. Nevertheless, a problem arises in that it may well be much harder to understand what such aural and musical phenomena might mean in the context of an analysis. Berkstead-Breen tells how, in the course of an analysis, the image of a rock fell unexpectedly into her mind. She soon verbalizes this image, firstly without elaboration, saying simply to her patient, "like a rock," and then she can start, at first privately, to develop the possible meanings of a rock for her patient in the current analytic situation. This instant illustrates clearly how a visual image and the word associated with it may mediate relatively easily between unconscious and conscious, primary and secondary process thinking. The same is not usually so true for musical phenomena. There can be instances where the meaning of a piece of music might similarly appear immediately available for metaphorical elaboration. A patient might dream of a national anthem, for instance. But music in itself is just not so apt for verbal translation. Indeed, caution is needed when it is the patient who associates to verbal music. A child psychoanalyst colleague told me of an instance where her young boy patient sang a particular song with great gusto. Having considered the meaning of the words, she found herself quite unconvinced that it was the text of the song that was analytically significant. Intuitively, she felt it was the music, the rhythm and the melody which meant something special to this boy at this moment in their relationship. However, she could not make a conscious verbal elaboration or interpretation of this musical moment in anything like the immediate way that Berkstead Brain could and did with her rock insight. This example shares much in common with those many times when I have myself as analyst associated to music. I now tell myself on those occasions to go slow, to stay with the musical association without verbal translation, but to note it. Sometimes a long time will pass before something about the musical experience might begin to make more rational sense to me. Nor is it so easy to carry out my own precept of going slow in some clinical circumstances. For example, in those times when passions are turbulent, not only in the patient, but also in the analyst. Nevertheless, I draw comfort from having such associations at all at such times. It reassures me that I am not quite taken over by one-dimensional, overly concrete or secondary process thinking myself, that I am still in touch via my unbidden musical associations with my own unconscious processes. But these contrasts between the visual and the oral may not always be quite so acute. In her next paper, Biocularity, Berkstead Brain focuses specifically on processes more akin to the musical ones I am describing, in terms of the necessity for a certain passage of time to occur. She gives a clinical example in which an image which occurred to her only began to yield more conscious result months later. She describes the importance of the analytic relationship between patient and analyst not collapsing into simply the conscious relationship between the two people. What makes it specifically psychoanalytic is that the analyst, however much she may choose to concentrate on the immediacy of the relationship, with one eye or eye, needs simultaneously to stay focused with the other eye or eye on the unconscious. I would add that the analyst also needs to practice a bi-auditory process, in which she listens with, as it were, two ears, one focused on the verbal level, the other on the music behind the words. It is from this latter arena, the unconscious of her patient, the analyst's unconscious, and the relationship necessarily unconscious between them, that images, visual or musical, arise unbidden, tuning into a paradoxically present, unconsciously, but absent consciously dimension. An experience which is usually uncanny and disturbing, which has to be accepted with faith in the analytic process, and which may only yield conscious fruit much later in the conscious clinical encounter. When I try and process musical associations in the clinical situation, I pay particular attention to the mood of the music, since it is especially depictions of mood which sounds and music more than any other arts or senses can evoke and convey with precision, flexibility, and conviction. I will then try verbally to elaborate the particularity of the mood, and will wonder whether it belongs to the patient or to myself, or to the relationship between us. Sometimes there are no surprises in store. The musical mood seems simply to add another layer of depth to an atmosphere already conscious. But the opposite can be true. I have now disciplined myself to attend, at least partially, to any music which is dissonant to my conscious mood, that might come unbidden into my mind in the course of the session. My first tendency used to be to dismiss such music from my mind when it arose, precisely because it hindered me concentrating on the verbal level, and it felt like a distraction. It even felt quite unethical to attend. But now I do try to attend, because experience has taught me that, at least sometimes, the music may be how my unconscious communicates to me about a very different set of feelings lurking somewhere, whether in the patient, myself, or between us. The emergence of sad music in my mind can therefore alert me to a depression which is not otherwise conscious. The emergence of happy music in my mind can alert me to the possibility that the apparently depressing situation in which the patient and I are currently embroiled is not the whole story, at least for one of us, even if it is all that is conscious. I am using rather overly clear examples to articulate the point. The actual musical clinical situations tend to be more subtle and complex, therefore usually hard to read. Now here's a case example. The most obvious way in which music plays a constant part in clinical psychoanalysis is in the actual vocal exchange between patient and analyst. Not only the sound, but the literal musical qualities of their voices, and how each reacts to the other's music, the duet. In the case of one female patient, the grating quality of her voice immediately made a forceful impact on me in the first consultation. Her music's pitch was somewhat unnaturally high, forced, and loud. When she came into analysis, I felt how often her music was out of harmony with the content of her speech, highly dissonant with the atmosphere she might otherwise be trying to convey, for example, at moments of quiet reflectiveness, of sadness, or of delicacy. I was troubled by my own reaction of discomfort, and particularly at the start, tended to find fault with myself for being overly sensitive, almost overly musical. I usually tried to ignore my own uneasiness and stress because it led to a real distaste for the noise, for the music, and hence, inevitably, to a dislike of the patient herself. I felt in a catch-22. If I acknowledged the effect her voice had on me, I criticized myself guiltily for being oversensitive. But if I disowned my musical discomfort, I could not help tuning out simultaneously from all sorts of other emotional reactions to the patient, ending in a rather cut-off position. Things only began to change after some time when I began properly to address the situation. I realized that I was longing to hear other pitches, other resonances, in fact, other musics, and even other voices from this patient. I began to allow myself to think that this frustration might not only be expressing my personal desire, which I was in danger of foisting onto the patient, but possibly also a more serious, authentic countertransference response, even a reaction to an important and rather desperate unconscious communication from the patient. I felt claustrophobically trapped within this highly reduced musical range, and I began to wonder whether my own longing to hear other musics and to increase and broaden the musical repertoire might reflect an unconscious situation in the patient's inner world, in which perhaps other voices longed also to sing with quite different styles of musical expression, but were being chronically inhibited and frustrated. This was quite at odds with my patient's conscious assessment of her own situation, in which she often came across as rather complacent about herself and her character. I was somewhat at a loss as to how to do anything about this technically. It felt wrong to address the matter directly. My patient would only feel persecuted and criticized. But I became increasingly aware that on a non-musical level, there was a sense in which other metaphorical voices within the patient were being ignored. I woke up to the significance that this was also true of me, in that her own conscious view of me tended to be rather narrow, essentially as analyst and father figure. I realized that she would often attribute opinions, voices, and emotional reactions she thought I would be having to others, which I interpreted. She would agree, apparently authentically, yet I realized that over time, this situation tended to repeat itself without any discernible sign of development or change. My music remained repetitively stuck for her in the same narrow, paternally musical role. I felt increasingly limited and controlled. Any non-paternal response would be given to others, say to a rather spiteful child or a particularly delicate young woman. They could not be mine, though if I interpreted them as mine, she would agree. Privately, I imagined how being allowed access to these roles would greatly enlarge my musical and emotional persona. After a considerable amount of time had passed, I pointed out that this situation seemed repetitive and unchanging. Initially discarding this interpretation, she reconsidered, finding this quite interesting. I realized how often a comparable situation occurred regarding her own self-image. I would show her that expressive qualities and comments of other people in her stories represented her own disowned feelings. Privately, I wondered how her voice, her music would begin to change if she could own the musical qualities she kept expelling. These interpretations, too, elicited apparent attention and interest, but for some time, no change, rather repetition. I began to interpret the deadness of this repetition, emphasizing more the lack of change in me as she perceived me and in our relationship, as I felt that to underscore her own lack of development could only be counterproductive and would probably constitute an acting in of my resentment about my frustration. I pondered more about the or anti-musicality of her voice. The penny dropped one day that it had the resonance of a child's voice well past the time of its natural end, a child's voice retained in terms of frequency, artificially high and dynamically loud, always overly positive in musical tone, on the edge of mania, even when the emotional verbal content might be quite the opposite, for example, sad or depressing. The patient's immaturity did not spread into all aspects of her life. Indeed, in some areas, she achieved a striking maturity. Yet she almost always described her capacity for making more mature decisions via the opinion of others, to whom she attributed properly adult roles. As a child, she had felt that her one and only reliable and good relationship was with her father. She was evidently clinging on to a central daughter-father Oedipal relationship with me, one quite desperate in its quality. I intuited that the child in her felt that to move on, truly to relinquish the centrality of this bond, was equated quite concretely with falling into the hands of seriously resentful and envious family members, especially her mother. For some years in the analysis, I was only given a narrative of an idealized relationship with her mother, again conveyed as much through the unconvincing musical qualities of the arias which she sang about her mother, as through her accompanying verbal description. It was the anti-musical drama I am relating which lent conviction to my suspicion that this idealization camouflaged serious hostility. I realized that my patient's feeling that she had continually to accord an exaggerated respect to others, accompanied by exaggerated gratitude, was motivated by a need to mollify their hatred of her in her fantasy. She was stuck in what might one think of as her internal opera, playing the role of this exaggerated child. In one sense, she was a prima donna, in that she was now caught in the narcissistic web she had spun for herself, with me in the supporting but coerced role of the ever-protecting and loving father. Yet, in another sense, she could not bear to learn whether she could sing with a full woman's voice. This would necessarily entail becoming aware not only of all the envy she imagined she was provoking in the supporting cast of characters, particularly mothers as well as siblings, but it would eventually also entail becoming aware that this envy was essentially her own in projected form. This would be to become a true prima donna, in a good sense, the prime mature singer in her own life, a voice which expressed the emotional atmosphere of the depressive position, a developmental project too fraught with danger and catastrophic possibilities. She preferred a defensive fixation in the musical ranges and tonal qualities of the paranoid schizoid position. I never spoke to her in these musical terms, but when I allowed myself privately to free associate musically in these ways, it freed me up interpretively, and gradually the impasse in the analysis lessened. In a way that I do not quite understand logically, but which I think had everything to do with the underlying musical intercommunication between the partners in the analytic couple, movement and flexibility ensued. Slowly, I began, as it were, to be allowed to take different roles and to sing in quite different voices, including children's, women's, sometimes animals, and with very different emotional musics: jealousy, parody, rage, humor. The change had to come in the object first, but soon a responsive change began to occur in the subject. My patient began to sing different arias, contrasting in mood, tempo, rhythm. Gradually, she began properly to appropriate to herself very different musical characteristics. If she did not find her way quite to becoming fully a prima donna, nevertheless, she was on her way. On a verbal level, she began to de-idealize her family, particularly her mother. This involved a paradox, since, as far as I was able to judge, in external reality, her mother had, in fact, usually felt very affectionately towards her daughter, and had not actually been overtly threatened by her in the Oedipal domain. The family drama of possessiveness, triumph, defeat, and hatred appeared far more strongly in my patient's fantasies. She was its victim. For years, her manic insistence on the ideally loving relationship between her and her mother, as a defense against a fantasy of that bitter rivalry for her father, obstructed her access to a more simple, ordinary loving relationship, including the capacity to get ordinarily angry with her mother. She realized that this caused her sorrow in terms of how much time she had spoiled and wasted. Emotional work such as this began to be reflected in different analytic music from us both. One important step in this direction was taken, I believe, as a result of her getting under my skin during one session and my becoming angry in reaction. I could tell that I was not managing to contain my anger adequately, and that it was showing in the music of my voice. My patient was in no doubt at all about it. She became flustered, talked of not quite feeling safe, and eventually became angry herself, at which point the session ended. I was left feeling anxious and self-critical and not sure what to expect when we next met. The following day, my patient told me she was still angry with me, but immediately went on to say that clearly she had more than one reaction. In a dream that night, she had been menaced by something threatening, and a big bear appeared. She was terrified, but it took her in its arms, and she felt completely secure and protected. She felt full of gratitude to the bear. Her subsequent sleep had been deep, and she had woken feeling refreshed. Music was involved throughout this mini-drama. The music between us had included my anger, her shock, her insecurity, her anger, my self-doubt, then all the music of the dream's narrative. She herself had interpreted that she had come to the second session with two sets of feelings simultaneously, her anger, but also the deep peace still resonating inside her from the dream. The music was beginning to get truly variegated, both in the analytic content, but also in its expression through our vocal duet. I include this story because, in my opinion, anger is one of the most difficult clinical issues we face, and the quality of the music, not so much accompanying as expressing angry exchanges, may count for a great deal in the emotional quality of the exchange, as to whether it is pro or anti-life. Hitherto, for my patient, anger was equated unthinkingly with destructiveness. Yet how can contact between two human beings, including analyst and patient, be authentic if anger is missing? This analytic event gave my patient the chance to experience anger as potentially creative and containing rather than destructive. She realized that it conveyed, amongst other things, my ordinary, non-ideal humanity, and also her own as she retaliated, and that it was, in addition, an expression of concern on my part, coming from a person who was emotionally engaged with her, rather than relating to her from a position of idealized detachment. Her dream demonstrated her unconscious capacities for grasping this intuitively, as opposed to her more defensively limited intellectual understanding. But the sine qua non of this crucial development in her and our analytic journey was the musical quality of the exchange, one I believe conveyed to her at an authentic, intuitive level that my anger was for her, not against her. The sequel was that she could begin to identify with me, to become naturally angry with me on occasion, and eventually to cease her unnatural inhibition of her anger with her family members, especially her mother. My patient's voice began to change, quite literally. I was interested to hear that on several occasions, this was commented on by her friends and family, including her mother. The pitch of her voice dropped, its expressiveness broadened, and its unnaturally loud and forced dynamic began to quieten, to communicate emotion through organic crescendos and diminuendos, occasionally through forte or fortissimo blasts, or the opposite, piano or pianissimo whispers, all of which felt emotionally apposite. Her abnormally forced treble tone gave way to a real woman's voice, somewhere in musical pitch between alto and mezzo-soprano. It was as if the natural vocal progression from child to adult had been arrested at a stage between latency and adolescence, as she clung desperately to remaining daddy's girl and to her attempt to force me to sing exclusively the song appropriate to the daddy in question. As she began to face her anxieties about relinquishing her hold on this relationship, her unconscious fantasy was all of loss. Instead, she experienced mostly gain, as the more adult woman she became was reflected in the much fuller musicality of her voice. I would say that her voice now musically reflected the ordinary oscillations between paranoid schizoid and depressive position states of mind. I wondered whether my voice, too, at least in the psychoanalytic sessions with her, had correspondingly broadened out. My suspicion is that a musical listener might well have noticed that, as a countertransference response, my own voice might often have been rather rigidified in the earlier phases of the analysis, becoming more expressive later. But this is only my uncorroborated speculation. Readers will have noticed that there is nothing particularly unusual about the fairly ordinary Oedipal dynamics in the narrative of this analysis. My choice of clinical illustration has been directed precisely by its ordinariness, my suspicion being that variations on this theme may be very common in analysis, but that for most analysts, the musical dimensions will be operating outside awareness. Now, I have written another couple of paragraphs, but I think I'll stop there, Sarosh, because I think I should stop so that we have at least 20 minutes for questions and answers. And if you're interested in the subject, there is a fuller discussion, including what the word musicality means in the paper I've published in the International Journal. But I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. This is really quite a very rich, original type of paper. It gives us a new way of looking at the communication between humans, and especially in the consulting room. it's something that I think in some ways, considering you point out it's universal, the musicality, the communication from very early times. You mentioned the womb, the sounds in the womb and so on. It's something that we've always known,
Yeah.
in that sense.
Yeah.
But you brought it to our attention in a very, in quite an impact. I mean, we've always in some ways known that the way we speak, give interpretations, the way the patients we realize hear us very closely, without really perhaps being conscious of how closely they monitor not just the words that we use, but how we sound. And I think we've always known that, but you bring it right in clarity to us. I was also thinking about, of course, you mentioned Freud, and of course, Freud. Not to idolize him, but I don't think he had a deaf ear, because he wouldn't have discovered all the analytic ideas he did, which no one had. If he didn't have, of course, he wasn't conscious of it. Francis, you weren't there to tell him that it was a sort of it that he often felt unsatisfied with what he had already theorized, as if he felt that it somehow that it wasn't in tune with further clinical observation. So Freud, I think, had the musicality in that sense to a very high degree. He was an artist.
Quite.
Yeah. And in that sense, of course, I think psychoanalysis is an art form, isn't it? More than, I think, a science. It's supposed to be more an art form, where we sort of listen, and in a way which you have pointed out in this paper, where we actually listen to not just the words, but to what it feels like. And now you bring in an extra item to the tone of the rhythm of the session. So I was really quite I was quite fascinated by your paper.
No, you've got it. You've got it. I quite agree. I don't say anything original in this paper. It's all there. It's all there. As you say, in a sense, we've always known all these things. It's just a matter of articulating them.
Yes. Yeah.
On art and science, I mean, I think that I suppose I think it's both. It's like what I'm doing with my hands is like an X and a Y axis. It's kind of, there's art and there's science, or there's science and there's art, and they. But what you say about Freud, I think, is quite right. In fact, in 1932 or something like that, he was awarded the Goethe Prize. And of course, he wouldn't have been awarded such a prize purely on the basis of his scientific achievement. The Goethe, of course, was usually thought of as the greatest of the German poets. So this being awarded to Freud was, very specifically in recognition of the artistic side of his work. What I don't quote in this, at least in this abridged version, is that what Freud said was that he didn't like being moved by something when he didn't understand why he was being moved by it. I think that is such a lovely thing that he said, because, of course, he's actually saying that he is moved by it. He doesn't like not understanding it, but he is moved by it. So, of course, as really we all know, Freud, in a sense, obviously had a musical ear. But again, I don't say this in this paper, but Melanie Klein was very musical. She loved to go to concerts. And as I say, with Dick, she actually played the piano in the child psychoanalysis with him, made interpretations about the piano and the music. However, what's extraordinary, really, I think anyway, is that with regard to the International Journal, in which I have a bit of an interest, she wrote the very first paper that was ever written on opera. She wrote on the Ravel opera L'Enfant et les Sortilèges. And it's a really interesting paper. And do you know, there's not one word about the music. So, you know, the influence of Freud, I think, who did really, you know, in a sort of serious way, turn against music in certain ways, was very influential in those first years. I think it was only really with the major change about countertransference in the 1950s, you know, when analysts began to really to pay attention to the affect more and more, including to their own emotions. I think that's what opened the door. But this paper by Anzieux that I talk about here, I still think it's almost the best paper that there is on music. And I recommend it to you all. He does write a beautiful clinical example. And it's interesting because he writes about a patient who he thinks part of his problem, a major part, is that he was brought up in what he calls this sound bath of his mother and his nanny. And Anzieux has a very dim view of the sounds that his mother and his nanny made. He thinks they made awful music. He thinks that, you know, that it was the disturbance was in the patient was not only the mother's and the nanny's thoughts and what they told him and everything else, but the sound which got right inside him, this terrible sort of dissonance that he was born into before he even became aware of his skin, you know. And clearly then in the work of the analysis, you know, the patient becomes much better. Anzieux fails, however, to make the obvious point that presumably one of the things that made the difference was that in the experience of the analysis, he then had an experience of a different sound bath, the sound bath of the analyst and of the analyst and patient together. And that over many years, the many years of the analysis, you know, this was one of the transformative functions of the analysis, along, of course, with all the verbal interpretations. So anyway, I should be quiet and listen to others.
Well, thank you so much, Francis. And it was like Sarosh said, it was a great paper and it was very impactful. And what you said is actually an understatement when you were saying that it was already there. It was just the same thing, but that is exactly what we do in psychoanalysis also. Whatever we tell the patient, it is nothing that we tell anything new. It is just everything that had been there. We just bring it out or help the patient to bring it out to himself or herself. So you did it quite well.
Thank you.
Sarosh, were you saying something?
No, just that we can't, of course, ignore the emotional aspect. You mentioned the music is the vehicle for the emotions. I mean, it is connected with the emotions. I mean,
it's very connected.
Yeah.
But it can be confusing because, you know, this is particularly of importance when the words and the music don't fit. So, for example, the patient may even describe the emotional state that they're in, but the music of their words might suggest a different one. So we're quite, I suppose a very obvious one is, you know, the patient may say, I'm fine, I'm feeling happy, you know, and there's nothing wrong with my life. And, you know, you're under a lot of pressure to agree with that. But what you hear is a miserable sound, a miserable song, as I would put it. So that's, one. But actually the analyst as well, if the analyst, and this paper is as much for the analyst as the patient, if the analyst, for example, responds in a rather cut off and kind of dry way, even though the verbal content of the interpretations might be very good, the dryness, for example, is actually what emotionally will communicate itself to the patient. Mm. And then we have a problem on our hands. And probably in some way or other, the patient will reflect that back to the analyst. But they might not do it directly. I mean, it's very unlikely. I mean, you might get a patient who might say, well, you say that, but you didn't sound as though you meant it. That would be very helpful because that would be a very good supervision from the patient. But you might get more like the first example that I used. The patient might make some comment, it'd be a free association about the weather or something, something that doesn't make sense. A sense of two things together, but there might be, you'd have to be awake. You'd have to be awake as the analyst to realize that you are indeed getting a response, and that what you're being told is that your the music, as it were, the song with which you're singing is not in tune with the content of your words. Because we do it all the time. Because we may be cut off. We may be very sad one day. We may be under the influence of something personal, which is sad. And so we're trying to be a good analyst and be professional. But if the patient needs to hear something happier from us, we may be unable to oblige, and so then our music may be at 6s and 7s. So
there could be a patient saying that I suddenly feel very cold.
Yes.
Spotting the coldness and the sort of lifelessness of what the list is saying.
Yes.
Francis, I think we need to open it out for discussion.
Of course.
To everyone else.
So any questions, any comments are welcome, or anybody can ask if there is any query in your mind, or if you can share your experiences, anything related to rhythm, music, anything musical in your experience, we are open. Yes, Panu?
Yeah, I was just, I mean, it's just a simple thing, just going by what all of you said. It's a when you're in the consulting room with the patient, there is some kind of a process that you are, a continuity, just like a music. There is a note, there is something that follows it, and ultimately it forms into something. It has a shape, it has a form, it has something like a pattern. And we study that with our patients. We have that opportunity to do that in the consulting room. And I was just thinking about unless it has a continuity, in that form, and ultimately it develops into something. For us, it has to develop into an interpretation that would make a difference. And unless it is the music or the interpretation that actually makes an effect on the patient or makes a difference to the patient, one can't call it good music, or one can't call it a good interpretation. I mean, one may think it is a right interpretation, or it's a great, something that you just found, or but one can't really call it a good interpretation unless it actually makes a difference. So, so once long ago, when I attended a music concert, one of the participants was asked, "What do you think is good music according to you?" And the young artist then said, anything that brings peace to the mind is good music. And I was just thinking about how, just the work of the analyst in the consulting room, and ultimately what becomes a good interpretation, or what is it that one hears and considers it to be, what you put it as musicality. If there's anything more that you can talk on this, yeah.
I think you make a very good point. It's interesting, the response that your musician gave you, isn't it? Anything that gives peace to the mind, because I don't think I would agree with that. I think that very often it's the business of a psychoanalyst to disturb the patient. When Bharati was saying, we are just, in a sense, uncovering what is there. Well, of course, all of us have been patients, and all of us try hard to cover an awful lot of things up. We don't really want to uncover them, because it's so disturbing to have them uncovered. So, actually, I think very often in interpretation, it can be exactly the opposite of what I'm saying, but very often an interpretation is going to be disturbing. It's going to uncover something, and the result of it is there is going to be disturbance. And this is very much the sort of area that I'm interested in, because, well, you can see that, in his famous paper about mutative interpretations, which you probably all studied, James Strachey talks about how difficult it is to make a really good mutative interpretation, because it's frightening, because you're going to be faced with the archaic objects of the patient, and they set off something in your own internal world as well. So for a start, there is a lot of pressure just not to make a good interpretation, but to make a different kind of an interpretation instead, to avoid the problem. Or one might try to address the problem, but something might go wrong with the music. Like you might, this is where you might give a dry interpretation. That would be a way of trying to avoid the emotional stress of it by taking the emotion out of it. Or you might, because probably you might be making an interpretation which is quite challenging to hear, you might, for example, make it in a rather placating kind of way. So the music might say, I know I'm hurting you by making this interpretation, but please go on liking me. I don't want you to be cross with me. The music might say that, even as the interpretation might say, this is your Oedipus complex, you want to have a sexual relationship with your mother and kill your father. That's a pretty disturbing interpretation for anyone to hear. But it's quite a difficult one, to be able to deliver and to receive it. So I think that the way that that's what, at the end of the day, your musician might be right in the biggest sort of way of thinking about this. You might hope that there would be some peace in the sense that the truthfulness, if you get at something very truthful, you hope that it might strike a chord, there's a musical metaphor, inside in a kind of peaceful way. But quite often you have to wait for a bit before you get to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I do agree with what you said, Francis, because, when Banu was saying that, it's peace that we are looking for, perhaps one does, but the aim of the music or perhaps any art is to touch the very emotion and conveying the emotion from the artist to the audience. So when that emotion is touched, when that chord is touched and one feels the same emotion. So a sad song or sad music is supposed to touch the chord of sadness in the audience. It may not be peaceful at all, but that is perhaps how art or music works.
Yeah, no, I was more connecting it to the interpretation.
Interpretation,
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, it doesn't
for sure.
it doesn't have to be peaceful. I mean, that's the artist is not a psychoanalyst, but
perhaps, Banu, perhaps, we often talk about, touching the chord, and we often see whether it has touched the right chord in the patient. And if it does, then perhaps it is the right kind of, I mean, I personally don't know whether we can use the word right so conclusively. It's a very complex thing.
Good.
Sure. Yeah. Professor Nagpal, you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
No, we can't hear you. Yeah. Unmute.
You'll have to unmute yourself.
No, we can't.
We can't unmute you. You'll have to unmute yourself. You can type it, then we can maybe read your question or comment.
Yeah, now it is. May I speak now?
Yes.
Thank you for your patience. I think on this part of what Banu brought in and what how you developed it, Francis, I just remembered a paper by Ogden, 2016 perhaps, in which radical modes of interpretation come up, in which the analyst takes in his or her own conduct led by the reveries that have happened, which Ogden is someone who's the great facility around. And through the reveries, he looks at the interpretation centers on the bad love, that he begins to wonder whether the patient is hearing the bad love. And he puts it in a manner that the bad love in him is what the patient is unable to hear. I can't reproduce the thing. I quickly wanted to go to the paper so as to give you an exact thing, but there are two cases that he takes up. In both the two cases that he takes up two emphases there. One is about that if an analyst were to experience a kind of love towards the patient, and the patient is burdened by it. In fact, there's a dialogue between the two. And then he says, why is it that you find my love as bad as to always put it out? And that's where a reverie has happened. I'm suggesting that Ogden, and the second one is something about how an elder sibling is burdened much too young, something that we find in India very often. A sibling, 6-year-old, picking up a baby who's few months old, and the whole burden of how to sort of carry it, and at the same time expect the parents, who can't often do much, to sort of relieve. So something that he produces over there. And so he becomes that sibling, the elder sibling. I hope I'm reproducing it correctly, but I'm very clear that he brings up two notorious emphases in human relationships. And the analyst tries to wait for that notoriety to emerge in his own reverie and then expresses it. And that, I think, joins the movement that is also gaining ground, which is very musical, which is not just being to becoming, but I will add, following or adapting both Sudhir Kakkar and Dodie Goldman, the aspect of beholding. So it's not just becoming, but that being to becoming, you come to behold. And that is where music in its vivid visual form is being summoned for on certain occasions, which I was most keenly drawn in Ogden's paper. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. No, that's very interesting. I mean, Ogden is terrific on this stuff, but he's guilty of using music purely in a metaphorical sense, and he's very, he gets a lot out of the actual verbal content, and it's great, sort of what he does. But I think that you know, and also he's obviously terrifically attuned to poetry, and poetry and music are at one level sort of like, you know, at one. I mean, what is poetry? You know, you could say poetry consists of words in a music, is a very self-consciously musical form, you know, delivered. So yes, I agree with everything you say. I just think that I think that analysts are very tuned in ever since Freud, particularly, even though Freud, you know, wonderfully sort of discovered the primary processes. The fact is that analytic discourse is so centered on using secondary modes of thinking. And also there's such a primacy of the visual, and even when you were talking just now, all this beholding and what you see, you know, that it's these things, they have a way of pushing the musical dimension into third place, or even into fourth or fifth, or, you know, into kind of an invisible, you say, I've used that metaphor there, you know, so they're not on the table. Whereas I actually think that when you meet somebody, of course, you know, there's so many different things that you're very affected by what you see in the person, and by other senses as well, by smelling and all these things. But the sound is very primal, and it's very powerful of what your patient does to you as an analyst, and also what you as the analyst does to the patient. So I think that we neglect the whole sound aspect and what I call the musical aspect at our peril, because so much happens, I think, on that level, sometimes only on that level. But particularly, I mean, in many an analysis, it doesn't much matter if you don't notice it, because it's all happening in the words anyway. But with some patients, it's absolutely crucial, you know. Now, I think that many times analysts are responding to the sounds. They just don't know that they are, you know, they're unconscious of it. But there are times when it's more problematic, you know, when really the analyst and the patient are not in tune with each other. And I think that there is a problem often with the analyst who isn't thinking about that dimension. So that's the one place where I get a bit fierce about this, you know, and I would like to see, you know, when one, for example, presents one's clinical work in a clinical seminar or something like that, you know, we always ask, don't we, if somebody gives a history and a background or something like that, we say, well, what's it like in the room? What's the experience in the room? Can you say something about not just the transference, but the countertransference? And I think really we would need to ask, if somebody doesn't say it, well, what's the sound quality like? What is the musical dimension? Because it's something that if a person's attention is turned towards it, they can speak about it. But otherwise, and I find very often, you know, you get a big surprise, you know, something becomes much clearer, or something becomes much more complex, or something, when you start to attend to the musical dimension. Anyway, that's what I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Perhaps there is another candidate who would like to go up. Shubha, would you?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Hello, Francis. I just wish to share an experience while listening to you. Hi, Francis. Beginning from where Sarosh asked you whether you can take pause while presenting the paper for 30 seconds. Somehow, while listening to your paper, I could not forget what he had said. It was like a music that kept playing in my mind, you know, the 30-second pause. And for quite some time, I did not understand why is it that I am unable to forget the request for pause. But when you spoke about your work with your patient, where you spoke about anger and how experiencing anger sort of changed the dynamics, I suddenly felt that, okay, perhaps the pause is about that, you know. And I remembered Winnicott's hate in countertransference and how he says it's valuable to feel the objective hate so that, you know, the relation and the work sort of can proceed. So yeah, I just wanted to share this experience. Thank you.
So are you saying you felt rather angry with me for not giving these famous pauses? And
no, yes, I did not perhaps feel angry, but yes, I was aware that there were times that I could attune, I could be very attentive, and there were times that I felt my attention wavering. So besides this was what Sarosh had asked that kept coming to me. So
yes,
as I was trying to understand, you know, your explanation about anger and, you know, being able to sort of came together for me. So the music,
no, that's very nice.
So the music came together for me. So yeah.
That's very nice. Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shubha.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so.
Francis, I just wanted to, in the pause, no one is saying anything. Just wanted to, I thought I was quite interested and quite struck by your talking about your feeling quite, you sort of, perhaps without realizing, brought up a feeling of anger. And you felt quite, in some ways guilty, a bit anxious after the patient left. And in some ways, I was just connecting to this, to the feel that perhaps the tone of what you said reverberated in your ear. You felt you said something which was harsh, which sounded harsh. And it wasn't particularly that emotionally you felt angry, but you felt it must have sounded harsh to the patient, what you said. And it seemed to, it's as if you felt quite worried about it. But as it turned out, the patient brought a dream. And in the dream, there was this bear, and she felt unsafe and terrified by this sudden picture of you, which sounded quite different from the usual picture, your usual idealized parental safety and comfort and so on. But it then seemed as if the bear seemed to be some sort of work that you and she had done together, which created an internalized containing object, which was not a fake object anymore, an idealized parental sort of object. And although that collapsed and she felt very at risk and vulnerable, she seemed to be able to deal with it when she came back. And that dealing with it seems to have been because of your work internally with her. It was internalized. It came out in the dream. So there seemed to be some change, as if she took you in, took the containing and the patient and the sensitive work you had done with her, which includes this idea of yours of the special ear, of not just the words, but the tone and the tune and the being in tune and so on. It seemed to have changed everything. And you became a human person. It's as if reality suddenly struck. and she was able to get in tune with something real rather than something idealized. I didn't quite know how to put this, but I felt quite interested in what you had said, which also connected with what you said later, that you felt somehow freer personally. You don't know why you felt freer. You felt somehow something you felt a gain somewhere, personally on your own. And this is something that I think people have noted, that it's not just the patient who benefits when things go in rhythm, but the analyst also benefits and gains. So I'm just quite interested in the way you put it and connected it.
Yes, but I'm right with you on that. I mean, but the one thing that is a bit different, though, from what you were saying is it wasn't just the sound that I thought had been harsh. I mean, I was angry, you know, but I mean, of course, one gets, well, I think it's obvious that from time to time one does get angry as an analyst, but I don't. I would, you know, obviously it's a particular kind of one of those emotions that I would normally strive to contain. I might ideally like to know that I'm angry, so I'm not in denial about it, but I'm not going to act it out, you know, by yelling at my patient. Well, I didn't yell at my patient, but nevertheless, my voice rose in pitch and I was angry. I knew I was angry and I knew I was a little bit out of control, you know, not badly so, a bit more so. So, you know, it was entirely real. You know, the anger was real. And I thought that the image of the bear was a very good one because, of course, in the dream, when she first saw the bear, she was very frightened, and bears can be very vicious and can hurt a human being badly. But in fact, this bear didn't. You know, the bear actually contained her. And so I thought that I happen to love animals myself, so I thought that was another way that I appreciated very much. You know, this particular image, you know, of a potentially dangerous beast, which was in fact very containing of her and enabled her to sleep very well. I thought it was a profound image, really, and good for her that she'd been able to dream it, been able to remember the dream, and been able to bring it alongside her own more conscious feeling, which was just of, you know, being very angry that her analyst had spoken to her in this kind of way. So a lot was going on. But otherwise, everything that you say is true. And I think it made a major shift in her feeling about me and the world, really, something much more human and less idealized. And that goes back to the question about peace, doesn't it? You know, there was certainly not a kind of idealized peace, but there was something which had more depth to it, and in that sense more truthful, possibly, you know, a deeper peace underneath it all, something like that, I think.
Sure, Anshu. Anshu would like to say something. Anshu, you unmute, yeah.
Yes. So it has been like a very interesting talk for me. Even the interaction has been so enriching. So I just it kind of jogged something in my memory as well.
Perhaps some discontinuity in music.
Yes.
Yeah, Anshu has joined again.
Really sorry for that, that very loud music which was created. So, you know, just what I wanted to share was something which was told to me by somebody who is like really very precious to me. So that person said that, you know, if sometimes you don't understand what.
It's just stopped, hasn't it?
Yeah. Am I now?
Ah. Oh,
yes,
there
we
you
can
are
hear
again.
you, Anshu.
So, I was told that if you sometimes get very confused about what is really going on, like we, as a person who's still learning, if you get so confused and, so sometimes, afterwards, maybe after the session, sometimes I sit and think about what song is coming to my mind about. And that is meaning I don't know how, meaning it was so helpful when I heard you. And sometimes that song is telling me something about my patient, and sometimes I'm also surprised that even during the session, I hear a song, like some song which is really like so, close to my heart. Like I'm working with a child who is very withdrawn. Like he will not talk for like 50 minutes in a session. He's a 12-year-old. And there's a Hindi song, which is like, Tum na jane kis jahan mein kho gaye, which is like, I don't know which world have you got lost in. That's the,
Sure.
yeah. And so that was what I was coming to my mind, that it is such a rich place for us, can allow ourselves to flow. So thank you.
It's a very interesting thing you say, the things that come to your mind. And one of the stories that I love on this is that I can't remember who the analyst is. I've got a feeling it was a French analyst, but I can't remember. But this analyst had a patient, a man, who was very close to his mother, who was widowed. And so he always told the analyst how terribly depressed his mother was, how sad she was, and he was looking after her. And the analyst sort of course, went along with this, was very sympathetic, until one day, in the middle of the session, when all this was happening again, the analyst found himself thinking of a song. And the song, you may know this, you may not know it, you can look it up on the internet afterwards. It's from a well-known operetta called The Merry Widow. It's the Merry Widow Waltz. And it's the very famous waltz from this opera in which this widow indeed is merry. She's enjoying herself in life in all sorts of ways. And it's a beautiful, famous waltz. And the analyst suddenly realized that if he really thought about what was being told him, I think he puts it that he got a picture of the patient's mother, which was potentially completely different from the one that the patient himself had been giving him. That possibly this picture of the patient's mother was really very distorted picture from the patient, who was perhaps very invested in his mother feeling miserable and needing his attention and needing his care and everything, when actually there were things in the story that suggested actually this mother, she might have her sad side, but she might indeed have a happy side and indeed rather enjoyed going out for parties and things, in a very different way. So that was, and I think there are many stories like that of things that occur to people. Songs which have a completely different kind of take from the predominant mood, the more obvious mood in the analysis.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it also makes it more bearable for me sometimes. Sometimes these feelings are so unbearable, and when you kind of connect it to a song, it as if also helps you to bear that moment.
Yes, that's absolutely right, I'm sure. Yeah, because the music then becomes a container of the feelings.
Thank you.
All right, we are almost coming towards the end. If anybody still wants to ask something or make any comment.
We can have one more, I think, no?
Yes. All right, Purvi.
Yeah, Purvi.
So thank you. I think I really liked this paper. And as you were reading it, this was very early on when I just started working with children. And I was really clueless of, what you're supposed to do. It was very early. And this was a 12-year-old boy who had come home and found his sister had committed suicide by hanging herself from the fan. And he had stopped talking, he wasn't eating. And that's when the parents were really worried and they had got him. Very thin, small, puny child. And I remember for 1 year, 3 sessions, the boy would only keep tapping his fingers on the desk. Or he would tap his feet with the shoes. And I would just keep trying to talk. And sometimes he would give some expression, sometimes he wouldn't, but not a single word. And it was as if my voice, like just now when I heard your paper and those were the thoughts going through my head, that he was playing some music and was there like did something, obviously he was in shock with what he came home to and he opened the door and did everything stop? Like did the noise stop? And then slowly was there just music in the session with his tapping, his finger things, and me just trying to say something. And I think after a point, I felt it wasn't relevant what I was saying. For him, it was just that there was some voice which was there, which probably made him feel held or something. And then the parents moved the city. I think it was too traumatic for the parents. So on the last day of the session, he had dragged a cricket bat, which was almost as big as him, and a ball. And he said, "Can we play cricket today?" And those were the only words. And he said, "Okay, let's play." And that was the last session. And it always stayed with me. So today, just now, when I heard your paper, I was wondering if that is what was happening. And I was trying very hard to make meaning of his expression, his this. But maybe all he wanted was the sound of the voice. So that was the thought that came to me when I heard your paper.
Well, it's certainly possible, isn't it? And of course, it's interesting that when you played cricket together, presumably you still heard the sound of wood on, after the tap, tap, tap. You bring in something interesting there, which is the business of the experience of the passage of time. Because I think that at certain very intense moments, like a terrible moment, and sometimes it can be like a wonderful moment, we can have an experience that time stops. And the normal passage of time sort of, just doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't even exist sometimes. So, and very often I think when there's a terrible trauma, that can happen. I mean, as I say, it can happen the other way. I think people who fall in love can have a sense that they get into a sort of timeless zone as well, for a while at least, or something. But I could imagine also that the not talking and everything was a kind of time being frozen in a sense, stopping happening, both whether it's the time of the seeing the terrible sight, or trying to stop the clock just before that moment, or even the awfulness of the time after that moment, or even going somewhere else in his mind just to avoid it all, up to the heavens or something, and stopping, and just with the just some minimal sense of rhythm, which would sort of mark the passage of time, even when it keeps still, is one thing that I found myself thinking in. I have no idea if that was happening for your patient, but it might have been. I think sometimes that does happen. In music, in actual music, where, there are times when, a piece of music, wherever it comes from, i.e. it might be Indian classical music, it might be Western classical music, it might give an impression of time passing very, very slowly. It might be very slow music, and the impression might be of timelessness. But of course, the musicians are all counting. They're all counting rhythm. you know, all the time that it's going on. So it's interesting, isn't it, that the sense of the rhythmic beat is always there, always happening. You know, time never actually stops, even at these kind of timeless moments. So that is a very interesting aspect of the musical dimension, because it's all about rhythm. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That really helped. Thank you.
So, Bharati, I think we need to stop.
Yes, I think.
Francis, thanks very much. You've most enjoyable evening for us. I don't know what time you have right now. Probably afternoon.
3:30. 3:30 in the afternoon.
You've left a lot for us to think about. And we hope one day you'd be able to come in person.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks to all of you. Thank you, Sarosh, for being here. Thank you, Francis. Especially, I would just like to conclude it with something that I asked Francis. I asked him if he can put in one word or in one thing that the music brings to psychoanalysis, and he didn't. He said, I can't, I give up on that. And I would say today that thank God that you didn't do that. You didn't bring it to one thing, because it is supposed to be multi-aspected and multi-dimensional, just like, you know, different aspects of our emotion and different aspects of music. So with that, thank you very much to bringing this musicality to us, and hope it will stay with us. And just like Sarosh said, let us invite you to the current Asia Pacific conference that we are going to have in January. If you can make it, please do come here. If you can't, you are welcome anytime when you visit India. Please just let us know. And thank you all of you. Without you, this webinar wouldn't have been possible. Thank you, Francis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Please do come. You're welcome over here in person.
Thank you. That's a lovely invitation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.